Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep into the federal racketeering and sex trafficking trial of Sean Diddy Combs. It's happening right now in New York City.
Yeah, and it's reached a really critical point.
Exactly. After, what, 6 intense weeks of testimony?
6 weeks, yeah. Now it's closing arguments.
And the stakes, I mean, they couldn't be higher. Diddy pleaded not guilty to everything.
Everything. And he's facing potential life in prison if convicted.
So our mission today, really, is to get past the headlines. We want to pull out the key insights from those closing arguments, both sides.
Right. Help you understand the legal game being played, the strategies, and some pretty surprising courtroom moments.
Okay, let's start with the prosecution. What was their main argument? How did they frame this?
Well, the feds painted a pretty stark picture. They basically characterized Combs as the leader, the head of a criminal enterprise.
A criminal enterprise, that's strong language.
Very. And they argued this enterprise existed purely to serve his, quote, personal desires.
What methods?
Through, again, quoting here, violence, coercion, and manipulation. And the list of alleged crimes was long.
Like what specifically?
Kidnapping, arson, forced labor, bribery, and of course, sex trafficking. It's a wide range.
That sounds like a huge case to build.
Yeah.
So what was the core story they wanted the jury to buy?
The core story was that Diddy basically created this world around him, an environment where his wants came first, and this whole structure, this enterprise, existed to make illegal things happen for him. They really hammered on the pattern, trying to show it wasn't just isolated incidents.
Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting strategically speaking. Right before closing arguments, the prosecution actually withdrew some charges. Attempted arson, attempted kidnapping.
That's right.
That feels significant. Like, what does that tell us? Maybe about their confidence in those specific parts? Or was it something else?
It tells us a lot, actually. It's a very calculated move. You know, in these complex Argo cases, that's the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Things can get complicated for a jury. The prosecution needs to, as they put it, streamline instructions.
Streamline how?
Well, for ICO, they need to prove at least 2 specific crimes happened over a 10-year period, all connected to this alleged enterprise.
Okay.
By dropping charges where maybe the evidence wasn't absolutely rock solid, they avoid the risk of the jury doubting the whole case just because they weren't convinced on 1 or 2 points.
Ah, so it's about focusing the jury. Sacrifice a couple of trees to save the forest, maybe?
Pretty much. It shows they're laser focused on nailing the core ICO elements. It's pragmatic. But, and this is crucial, the arson against Kid Cootie's car, that's still very much in play.
Okay, so they dropped some, but kept the Cootie car arson.
Yeah.
What else are they really focusing on now in closings?
They're hitting hard on bribery, that Kid Cootie car arson we mentioned, and various drug offenses. They're basically saying, look, we dropped a couple, but we still have scores of others, plenty more crimes to prove this enterprise existed.
And another key legal point they brought up was the Mann Act. For folks listening who aren't lawyers, what's the Mann Act about, and what was the prosecution's specific take on it here?
Good question. It's central to their sex crime allegations. The Mann Act is a federal law, basically, against transporting people across state lines for illegal sexual activity, like prostitution.
Okay.
Now, the prosecution's argument here is critical. They claim that to prove a Mann Act violation, they don't need to show force, fraud, or coercion.
Wait, really? Not even coercion? What about consent?
Their argument is that even consent doesn't matter for the Mann Act charge itself. They just need to prove people were flown across state lines for commercial sex and that Diddy allegedly paid for and organized it. They even pointed to the R. Kelly case as precedent for that specific interpretation, saying just facilitating the transport can be enough.
Wow. Okay.
Yep.
And they also had this one instance argument for sex trafficking.
Yes. They argued that they only need to prove Diddy coerced someone into commercial sex acts one single time to make it count as sex trafficking under the law.
Just once.
Just once for that specific charge. They presented a lot of evidence to show, quote, the world that he created, this alleged enterprise environment. But they're telling the jury, we don't need you to believe every single story to convict on this count, just one instance of coercion. It's another way to simplify, perhaps.
Okay, let's completely switch gears now.
Yeah.
The defense. Their strategy was, well, bold is one word for it. Maybe surprising, given how long the trial was.
Oh, absolutely. What really stood out was their decision not to call a single witness.
0 witnesses after 6 weeks of the prosecution's case.
Zero. It's a massive statement. It signals huge confidence, or at least the appearance of it.
What's the message they're sending with that?
They're essentially telling the jury the prosecution didn't prove their case. There's already reasonable doubt based on their own evidence. We don't even need to put anyone up. It's a nothing to see here posture.
That's a real gamble. So if they're not calling witnesses, what was their counter-argument, especially in those huge sex trafficking claims?
Their core strategy was summed up in one word: consent.
Consent. How do they argue that?
They showed things like loving text messages between Cassie and Diddy.
Yeah.
The idea was to portray the relationships as consensual, not coerced.
Loving texts versus trafficking allegations.
Yeah.
That's quite a contrast.
Definitely. And they also pointed to testimony that suggested Cassie and another woman, Jane, engaged in what was called freak-offs, sometimes without Diddy even there.
Right.
The defense argued this showed volition, choice, even preferences about who participated, all pointing, in their view, towards consensual activity, not trafficking.
So they're presenting these texts and activities as evidence of consent. How convincing do you think that might be for a jury, especially weighed against everything else?
That's the absolute key question, isn't it? The defense is betting the jury sees this as, the private choices of adults, maybe messy, maybe unconventional, but not a criminal enterprise.
So framing it as lifestyle, not crime.
Exactly. They explicitly called it a swinger's lifestyle, private conduct, long-term relationships. They hammered the idea that this stuff, however you judge it morally, doesn't add up to a federal racketeering enterprise.
And they even use humor.
Yeah, they apparently mocked the federal searches on his homes, tried to use sarcasm to paint the whole RKO charge as, governmental overreach into private life, trying to make it seem ridiculous.
Okay, but what about the really difficult stuff? The things that are hard to spin, like the domestic violence, particularly that hotel video. How did the defense handle that?
That was maybe the riskiest move they made. They actually showed parts of that hotel beating video themselves.
It showed it. Why?
It was a tactic. They conceded right away that what Diddy did in that video was terrible, illegal, wrong, inexcusable. They even said he'd plead guilty if charged just for that assault.
So they admit the violence.
They admit that specific instance of violence, yes. But then they immediately pivoted. They argued it was very separate from the RK and sex trafficking charges.
How do they separate it?
Their claim was his rage in that moment was only about getting his cell phone back, which he thought Cassie took, not about controlling her for sex trafficking. They tried to contain that specific awful act, keep it walled off from the enterprise charges.
Wow. Compartmentalizing.
Precisely. And they also hit hard on the RQO charge itself, questioning why no co-conspirators, no insiders were testifying against Diddy.
Right. You usually expect that in mob-style IQ cases.
Exactly. They argued, where's the agreement? Where's the proof Diddy actually conspired with others to commit these crimes as an enterprise? They suggested the lack of that kind of testimony weakened the whole IQR framework.
Okay, so we have these intense, complex arguments from both sides. Let's talk about the jury. What do we know about the people deciding Diddy's fate?
We know the jury is made up of 8 men and 4 women, and there's a pretty wide age range from 30 up to 74.
Does that age range matter?
It absolutely could. Different age groups might interpret the evidence, especially around lifestyle and relationships, very differently. And remember, for a conviction, it has to be unanimous.
All 12 have to agree.
All 12. So unless the prosecution really managed to tie everything together perfectly, make it crystal clear for everyone, that diversity, that range of perspectives probably favors the defense.
Why?
Because it only takes one juror holding out, one person with reasonable doubt, to hang the jury or force an acquittal. And you never know which juror that might be, regardless of demographics.
What was the vibe like in the courtroom during these closings? Tense. Packed.
Definitely packed. Overflow rooms were needed, and Diddy's family was there, his sons, daughters, his mother. A real show of support.
And Diddy himself, how was his demeanor?
Described as being in very good spirits, actually. Smiling, talking with his lawyers, apparently even gave his daughter a fist pump after she passed him a note.
Interesting. And you mentioned something surprising from the overflow room.
Yeah, this was pretty telling. Reportedly, when the defense attorney finished his closing argument, the overflow courtroom just erupted in cheers and loud clapping.
Cheers. In the courthouse.
Cheers and clapping. Gives you a sense of some of the public sentiment, at least among those who showed up. And Diddy's lead lawyer, Mark Agnifilo, apparently had a very engaging style, kind of folksy.
Oh, so.
Well, he made this joke about the government seizing Astroglide and baby oil from Diddy's bedroom during the raids.
He joked about that.
He did. And reportedly, 3 jurors actually laughed. The clear tactic there was to make the government's focus on private sexual matters seem, well, ridiculous, like an overreach.
And he didn't stop there. He made a really provocative claim about Cassie Ventura, didn't he?
He absolutely did. He called Cassie the real winner in all this.
The real winner. Why?
He pointed directly to her $30 million lawsuit settlement, calling that the catalyst for the whole federal case. He basically suggested her motive was a quest for money, not justice.
That's a direct attack on her credibility.
A very direct attack. He contrasted her being somewhere around the world right now with $30 million, while Diddy was, quote, locked up behind Mars.
Wait, locked up? Did the jury know Diddy was incarcerated during the trial?
Apparently not. That's the shocking part. Reports say the jury wasn't aware he was being held, and Agnifilo actually gestured towards the U.S. Marshal escorting Diddy when he said it.
Whoa. Revealing that to the jury right at the end. That's bold. Or desperate.
It was definitely seen as a very high-risk, potentially rule-bending move right at the finish line.
Okay, let's widen the lens a bit. What's happening outside the courtroom? Any reactions, especially from Diddy's family?
Yeah, there's been some significant buzz and controversy around Diddy's son, Christian King Combs.
What does he do?
Right during the closing arguments, he released new music, tracks like Diddy Free and People Like Me, some produced by Kanye West.
And the lyrics.
Pretty provocative, things like F the Witnesses and Don't Turn Your Back on My Family.
Wow. During closing arguments, the timing.
Exactly. Critics jumped on it, calling it incredibly bad timing, accusing him of using this for marketing, even taunting the feds.
But is there another way to see it?
Well, the counter-argument is, maybe it's just a son expressing himself, defending his family during an intensely stressful public time. It's complex how artists respond to things like this in real time.
So putting this all together, the arguments, the strategies, the jury, the outside noise, what are the experts predicting? What's the likely outcome here?
Attorney Ryan Smith, who's been following this closely, he offered a prediction. He thinks a conviction on the transportation of individuals to engage in prostitution charge-ater. The Mann Act stuff we talked about seems more likely.
Why that one specifically?
The evidence there might be clearer, perhaps less reliant on proving coercion, but for the really big charges, ROC and sex trafficking, Smith called those 50-50.
50-50. So not a sure thing for the prosecution.
No, definitely not a slam dunk, he said.
Yeah.
Not an easy one to prove. And he boiled down the jury's core challenge to this question. We see that Diddy is a bad guy. We see that he did bad things. But are they criminal things?
That distinction is everything, isn't it? Bad behavior versus provable federal crimes.
It's exactly what the jury has to parse, and it's a huge task, especially with the beyond a reasonable doubt standard. And the stakes are massive for the prosecution, too, let's not forget.
Oh, so?
If Diddy gets convicted only on lesser charges, say transportation, but beats the RQ and sex trafficking counts, that would be seen as a huge loss for the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Because the big penalties are tied to those top charges.
Right. The potential life sentence is linked to RQ and trafficking. They went after a powerful figure with huge charges, aiming for major accountability. Anything less than conviction on those top counts would feel like a defeat for them.
This whole deep dive just underscores the incredible complexity here. The arguments are so nuanced, the strategies so layered on both sides. It's really a high-stakes legal chess match.
It absolutely is. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it really makes you think, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, think about it. We live in this era where we know so much, maybe too much, about public figures' private lives. So the question becomes, for you listening, how do we as a society and how does the legal system draw that line? The line between behavior that's maybe morally questionable or even reprehensible and behavior that meets the strict legal definition of a crime.
Especially when the law requires proving things like a structured criminal enterprise or specific coercion beyond a reasonable doubt.
Exactly. It's not just about whether you like someone or approve of their lifestyle. It's about the evidence meeting a very high legal bar. So what stands out to you is the biggest challenge in a case like this? Is it tougher for the prosecution to prove that complex enterprise or for the defense to create enough doubt about consent and coercion? Something to really mull over.